talking about other international issues. Famous comedian and podcaster Russell Brand. We sort of set this up beforehand, but this is going to be the more holistic approach to Brand. And excuse me, Lord help me, man. I mean, like, could you tell me in the audience, like, you say you're a super fan. I mean, like, what brought you into the Brandian universe in the first place? Like, who is this character that's like worth, us being maybe upset or keeping up with, what?
Yeah. Well, part of it is podcast audience. So
Mhm.
I came to Russell Brand through a little website called Pilkopedia, which is a fan forum for the Ricky Gervais show, which was
Yes, you're a
another
big
show.
Ricky Gervais fan too, weren't you?
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, like when I talk about other stuff, I still think about listening, going back and listening to those things because they still make me laugh a lot. Carl Pilkington being the producer of the Ricky Gervais show, along with Stephen Merchant. And Carl produced the early editions of a Russell Brand show, and so I listened to those, and that was my first
Mm.
sort of helping of Russ. And he had this amazing energy that I think people, like some people, get annoyed by. I appreciate. And a sort of vivacity to Russ, and a genuine curiosity. And so he did and then he sort of blew up around then. Mainly, it's hard for me to remember because he was doing a whole bunch of other things at the time. He was a sort of like talking head on reality TV.
Mhm.
Sort of like after Big Brother, they have a show called Big Mouth, and Russ hosted that. I'm not familiar with that work, but at the same time, he was doing these radio shows on the BBC, and they were very funny. And I wonder how they age now because there's some stuff, but like I don't know. I don't think it's an. I still think probably Russ is a very good broadcaster,
Yeah.
and like it really, frankly, like I sort of stopped. I followed him through BBC Six Radio Two, like I said, and then that ended with sort of like a scandal thing that's too big to get into now. And then I followed him. He went sort of like slightly independent on a few different platforms. I followed that. I loved it. I think him and his sort of co-host Matt Morgan have great chemistry.
Mhm.
Started doing this like the trues, and
Mhm.
basically the shit I was doing every day, and I just didn't have much of an appetite for it because I don't think like that's it wasn't as funny. And I just like I appreciate you support Jeremy Corbyn, stuff like that. That's cool. And like these sort of like narratives about the media, which we all have to be critical of capitalist media. And but I just was less and less interested, and he just didn't. He got it, and he'd start, as far as I can tell, doing shows with Matt Morgan, that was the real chemistry I was there for.
Yeah, I mean, like, his political trajectory is, like, interesting because I mean, I knew about him as a figure, so, not gonna say I came across him through, like, Mark Fisher or any of these other folks, right? Forgetting Sarah Marshall, I think, was probably the first time,
Hmm.
I saw any of his stuff, but, very famously, like, he is one of the introductory, like, points or, like, breaking, stories that, like, Mark Fisher's using to sort of talk about, like, this moralizing aspect to the left, and, like, I still think Exiting the Vampire Castle is an excellent essay. I think it
Hmm.
really does highlight, a lot of these problems, and in fact, I still think that Mark Fisher's defense of Russell Brand at that moment was 100% correct. And I'll read from that in just one second. But like Brand's trajectory, unfortunately, like you could see this coming before maybe the COVID stuff or whatever. I think opened up the door because you start to see him getting worry of like using the term like political revolution or like revolution, starts talking about like spiritual revolution or like a value revolution, right? And you start getting into stuff like that. It's like, okay, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And I think falls into this kind of trap that I find a lot of like the new age world, again, like a world I'm very familiar with, have a lot of sympathy for, fall into, at least politically, right? I don't speak to anybody's personal beliefs on things, but like politically, which is sort of say like, well, there's conflict here, right? therefore we need to like get away from like the conflict and like reach understanding, right? When it's like, well, there's always going to be conflict, and in fact most of the conflict that's happening is like one-sided, in the sense of like you're being exploited constantly by the society. And it's very nice for you to maybe take a kind of personal position on like not wanting to create more conflict or discomfort or whatever in the world, but you're basically acquiescing to the interests of like your boss and to these forces. When you abstract yourself out of these problems, say like, well, if I just work on myself, right, if I can just be kind and
Right.
whatever, then these things will get dealt with. It's like, no, sometimes like you have to be able to stand up collectively and say no more, like we're doing something different. And I don't know, like with Brand, whenever I would come across the stuff like in the Bernie Corbyn era, like you could start to see a hesitancy as those things are starting to boil up, and like, all right, conflict's happening, maybe something's going to happen. Walking back, which again is surprising because like he came from, at least like the reason that so many people on the left like considered him a leftist is because he was such a bombastic supportive shit. Like, eventually people are going to rise up and do something, right?
Yeah.
um so I mean, but maybe before we get to the Crowder, sorry if the intro is too long, but like I want to read just a second from the Fisher piece, just to remind folks, because um I think it's really great. And like I won't read the whole thing because it's actually a pretty long opening from Mark Fisher on Russell Brand. But basically, like there's like a kind of like labor socialist event, and this is shortly after Brand just had a very like prolific appearance um, with Jeremy Paxman, who's a real fella. I'll just put it at that. And like called him out, and like it was like a really great, piece of media doing exactly the kinds of things that he didn't do with Tucker Carlson, honestly.
Yeah.
Challenging these people, getting on a major platform and saying like, hey, the way you're talking about people, the way you're talking about society is wrong.
I mean, that's the contrast, right? Like this would have been like if you went with Jeremy Paxman and be like, "Hey, you do off well hard questioning, right? Like you do." I'm trying to do a Russell Brand impression. I can't do the Cockney, but like and we have these agreements about the importance of the press or whatever the fuck, right? Like instead he went at him.
Hmm. And Mark Fisher appreciated this. Is like, you know, um, that this was something different. This is very Mark Fisher, in fairness, but like politics as a psychedelic dismantling of existing reality. This was communism as something cool, sexy, and proletarian, instead of the typical finger wagging sermon, which frankly we're still in, right?
Right, right.
And it's like that's the one thing. Was like when Ben was on Rogan, people were like, well, why didn't Ben just spend the entire time like coming at Rogan? It's like, well, I also don't think that that's going to be the strategy that's going to work, particularly on something that's not live like a Rogan, right? um the point there is to talk to them about their things and meet people, whatever. But still being firm in your beliefs, just like what Bernie did, right? I still, this is so insane to me, sorry, I'm about to go on a tirade, but like it's crazy when you start to read some of the postmortems of 2020, and that it was Bernie's like utilizing of the Joe Rogan endorsement that really set AOC up to sort of pull back from campaigning him in 2020. I cannot handle that shit. I think that is so
Mm,
insane,
I forgot
personally.
about that. Yeah.
um Again, like the finger wagging sermon, was clear back then when Fisher wrote this piece, and it's still here today. But anyways, let's just get to the defense. The next night, it was clear that Brand's appearance had produced a moment of splitting. For some of us, Brand's forensic takedown of Paxman was intensely moving, miraculous. I couldn't even remember the last time a person from a working class background had been given the space so consummately destroyed. To so consummately destroy a class, quote, superior using intelligence and reason. This wasn't Johnny Rotten swearing at Bill Grundy, an act of antagonism which confirmed rather than challenged class stereotypes. Brand had outwitted Paxman, and the use of humor was what separated Brand from the dourness of so much leftism. Brand makes people feel good about themselves, whereas the moralizing left specializes in making people feel bad, and is not happy until their heads are bent in guilt and self-loathing. The moralizing left quickly ensured that the story was not about Brand's extraordinary breach of the bland conventions of mainstream media debate, nor about his claim that revolution was going to happen. This claim could only be heard by the cloth-eared, petite bourgeois, narcissistic left, as Brand saying that he wanted to lead the revolution, something that they responded to with typical resentment. I don't need a jumped-up celebrity to lead me. For the moralizers, the dominant story was to be about Brand's personal conduct, specifically his sexism. In the febrile McCarthyite atmosphere fermented by the moralizing left, remarks that could be construed as sexist mean that Brand is a sexist, which also meant that he is a misogynist. Colt, cut and dried, finished, condemned. And if you haven't read that piece, you should read
Now, what was the sexism that they were like getting him for? Was it a rehash of the BBC
Bird.
radio stuff? What? Oh, he said bird?
Because his like using terms like bird and things like that, which is
Yeah, okay.
English stuff.
Yeah,
And
ridiculous.
he apologized in a very like legit way too for that. I don't know if you remember. He said, people have told me like in the way that like is sort of like the quintessential like how you're supposed to respond to that. Like people were saying that this is like offensive to them. I didn't mean it in that way. I like proletarian. He literally said like I have a love of like proletarian language and linguistics. So when I say that, it's just an affect. It's not like meaning to demean anybody. But if
Yeah.
people are telling me, particularly women are telling me this, then I will listen to them. I remember my grandmother, the sweetest woman, but she was a racist. And I don't think she realized that she was a racist, right? And it was just like the most, like, what else could you want other than like perpetual groveling thing? And like, I mean, again, this is like why the Mark Fisher essay is so great is because it sort of highlights that like a lot of that stuff isn't about even like maybe changing behavior. It's actually like about beating people down, and it's super nasty. But anyways, I bring all this up just to say that like it's wild to now in 2023 be trying to talk about Brand, but I think that this is much more substantive than some of the critiques that came around then.
Yeah, and this is what's sad is like, he's now business partners with people like Steven Crowder.
Yeah.
So like we mentioned earlier, Rumble is a company like that. It went public last fall, not quite at the break even point. But this is just to give it like disinterestedness is a pretty old concept to say like you don't have a stake materially in what you are the sort of views you're espousing. And look, Russ, I think might believe a lot of the stuff he's saying here, but the
Mhm.
fact is he's not disinterested in saying it because it is literally the pitch of the corporation that he works for.
Yeah.
So here's just an old article from Investor Place, but this is just anytime you look up uh, CFVI, which merged with Rumble and now it goes under Rumble. But Free Speech Angle makes CF Acquisition Corp 6 worth a look, even beyond Trump's trade trajectory. So the Trump stuff is they were hosting for Truth Social, and so this is the marketing pitch for this corporation. It's as and look, like you might believe that's true. You can invest in a company
Hmm.
that thinks that this is solved. But I personally have seen a lot of companies sort of founded precisely for this supposed reason, and they don't end up actually doing anything beyond really like milking anti-vaxxers and the far right. Like,
And
yeah, go ahead.
no. I just want to make. I think we should do a longer segment on this in the future. I know we've talked about it, but like, I think it's really important too to remember that like this whole thing about like independent media, it's BS. Not in the like in the sense of this. It's like Matt and I like we are effectively like we are employees of YouTube. We are employees of Twitch, right? Maybe not directly, right? We like make our own decision to utilize these platforms or whatever, but like that's how we reach folks. That's how you guys are watching us right now. And within those platforms, there are certain constraints and certain things that it tries to push you to do in order to be successful, right? So it's not as strong in these platforms as like literally somebody coming down saying like you got to cover this, you got to cover that. But like all these platforms sort of encourage you to do certain things, right? And again, it's not explicit. You learn it, right? You learn like here's what the algorithm likes, here's what it doesn't like, and like you can try to not follow that. I think we try, to as best as we can to not follow that. We get punished for it. But the fact is like that is like a constraint. And like what I'm saying is that like Rumble and all these things, like they have a business model too. And like the Rumble thing is like just have the conversations that are going to get you in trouble with like the YouTube terms of service, right?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And
so
like
when you're
there's
going on, you're talking about free speech. It's like as you were saying, Matt. Like I just wanted to really highlight that. It's like you're doing it in serve. Like yeah, again, you're a free actor, right? Just like you're free to choose where you work, right? But you're constrained, and like there's constraints on Rumble, there's constraints on YouTube. Even if they're not like we're going to ban you or bar you or whatever, this is what's going to get you popularity. This is what's going to get you attention. This is what's going to get you views and money, etc. And this is what isn't. And that's how those platforms are set up. And YouTube has the same kind of incentives as well.
Yeah, and look, it's interesting that Steven Crowder ended up on Rumble. It's something I did not predict when he started his whole dispute with the Daily Wire, but it makes an awful lot of sense now
Mhm.
that he did that because, again, like maybe Crowder, that was all principle, or maybe it was a stunt, setting up a future sort of line of attack on competitors. But let's play this. Russ sat down with Steven Crowder for an hour-long conversation, and here's a little bit of highlights from that. Beginning with this, it's just, I mean, look, I think like you should have openness and like conversations, but I think there needs to be some sort of adversarial nature. So Russ tries to combine this like need for open debate and conviviality in a way
Yeah.
that I think just isn't that's more business partners speaking than sort of, I guess, political enemies.
Months, maybe Carrie Lake as a guest. Him quoting the CDC, I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He shook me down afterwards, became CEO.
So you have like created a pretty powerful community there with your mug club.
Yeah.
And some of the shows of yours that I've thought have really given me pause for thought, even though, as we've already mentioned and will be clear to anybody that's familiar with our work, there are points of disagreement, but as the cultural landscape continues to shift, as censorship continues to, broadly speaking, become exacerbated, it's clear that new forms of alliance and conviviality are going to be necessary. And
so yeah, I mean, just the mug club is great. It's given me pause for thought. The almost like bored of the objections of like, oh yeah, people say you're going to disagree, but we need to have these new avenues. And yeah, that's what the whole business proposition of Rumble is. So I just want to like let's let this develop a little bit further.
New forms of alliance and conviviality are going to be necessary. And I feel like the areas where we agree is generally personal autonomy, the ability to run your own community. Obviously and evidently, we should make clear on this platform the right to speak freely and disagree. One of the things I've always enjoyed is the sense of community that you bring to Mug Club. And do you feel like even in some of your targets comedically that there's a sort of a sense of warmth and engagement? How much anger do you feel there is in the stuff you do?
If you were to hear the left, they would say that.
Now, so just before I let Crowder go and talk about Russell's a real fucking comedian, which drives me crazy about this. But before I let him talk about Steven Crowder, like about his process, Steven Crowder, like one joke that I remember is him driving up to undocumented workers in like a Lowe's parking lot and fucking playing mariachi music at them. So is there warmth in that? Like, I mean, give me a fucking break. Were you gonna say something?
No, keep going.
This really, I can't believe Russ has this blows me
sense of warmth and engagement. How much anger do you feel there is in the stuff you do?
If you were to hear the left, they would say that we're bullies because they say you should only punch up. But what I say is, well, when you silence people, for example, if we can't speak out against children transitioning, wherever someone lines up children on puberty blockers, and so we do jokes about that. One of the episodes we got suspended.
Now, Russ does not respond to this at all, the puberty blockers thing. I mean, I'll just let it run.
There was a sexual assault that took place in a prison, an all-female prison, and it was a formerly male, I would argue currently male prisoner who did the assaulting. So we did a sketch where Alex Jones visited this woman as the angel Gabriel, and he said, you shall. She said, I'll have a son. What was? I don't remember what it was. We were suspended, and he said, no, your cellmate's going to rape you. Repeatedly. And that was a joke, dressed up as an angel. They suspended us for that, even though it was a true case, right? But what happens is I don't see that as punching down. I see that as punching at the powers that be. There are certain topics, third rails, that you can't discuss. I don't see it as punching down if you talk about the European Union, you talk about the atrocities that they've committed against their own people when we're dealing with COVID, right?
Okay, so, I mean, that entire thing of, there's some warmth to your humor. Explain that to me, Stephen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, those trans doctors putting kids on puberty blockers willingly. Not happening. Not
Mhm.
happening. To the extent that kids go on puberty blockers, it's after extensive counseling, after long periods of time, and social transition, which Steven Crowder is also against. I don't know where Brand stands on this stuff. He doesn't, he didn't have a problem with Tucker on it. We saw his only problem with Tucker was the homelessness stuff. But that whole stuff was it was entirely bullshit. And the joke was a rape joke about Alex Jones in prison. Rape is illegal in prison. It should be like there should not be rapes in prison. We're all against rape in prison, whether it's a trans person or a non-trans person. Like, and then it was let's see how Russell fields this.
Violations of human rights in my homeland of Canada. That is something that I know. When we do these shows, live shows, and I'll do stand up, and we'll have these big theaters. People show up with their mug, and they say, you know what, I felt like there was nothing out there for me. I was at Fox News for 4.5 years, and love a lot of people there, but it just clearly wasn't a fit where they'd be like, hey, could you soften your edges? Hey, could you put on a jacket and tie? Hey, could you maybe change the way you frame this? And I remember pitching changed my mind, pitching it as a book and pitching it as a segment. And they said, that'll never work. On cable news, we want you to do it short, and we want you to be in a quadrant view so it looks more international. I said, well, I think it would work. I said, conservatives don't really like comedy like that. I was influenced by Letterman and by Stossel, and said, I actually saw you perform at the Just for Laughs when I was just a little boy. I was a seat filler. I got to do it every.
Yeah, so pretty grim. To just let him go on and not say anything.
No, I mean, absolutely. And like, look, it's not there, but camaraderie, friendship, community, like, where is this value that you think? I really think that maybe it's just like the way that like the left might talk about this, or like popular culture imagine this, like, like, um one thing that's like distinctive about like fascism than even like traditional like conservatism or like Confederate thought or all these other kind of right-wing strains out there is that, like, well, in like Nazism, in fascism, there's community, there's conviviality, right? There's friendship and all these things. The friendship of the race, the friendship of the nation, like the community of that, right? Like, what the way that some people talk about this, and some people think it's sort of countercultural to talk about this, um, you really can find yourself obscuring some of the most horrific movements in history, right? Like, there was community in like fascist Europe, right? Like, that was the point, was it was creating it by like excising the antisocial, anti-community sections of society, right? Brutally. Right, so like the whole thing is like, well, we disagree on things, but you want community, and like you want like all this stuff.
No.
It's like, it's ridiculous.
That's such a good point, and it's one that like I think Russell doesn't understand how like neo-Confederate it can sound when you're saying stuff like, "Oh, we just all want to keep. We don't want this overpowering tyrannical state to come change how we do our community."
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that maybe has the same resonance in the UK as it does here.
No, I don't know. Like, I mean, we're gonna have Danny Bessner on Tuesday to
Right.
talk more about fascism, but like, like really, sometimes it's like when I hear people talk about like what fascism is, like, I think they miss like what was like the flame that it, like, brought a lot of people into it, right? And like, like, it's a lot of bad things, but they were like, we're going to create a nation that like looks out for one another, blah blah blah, like all this kind of stuff. So like, when you say love and community and all these things, like, these don't have like defined limits on them. So what politically minded person ever is going to say like, I'm against the movement of love, right?
Mhm.
Except for maybe like a like a purposeful like shock jock kind of person, like a Nick Fuentes or whatever, like those kind of people might say no to that. But like, they all are like, this is about humanity and about bringing people together and about love and about community. It's a
Yeah.
brutal, nasty one. And like, you can't be so naive to not be like, okay, well, what is this? What is the Mug Club, Matt? Right? It's about a bunch of people coming together, or it's about like, hey, what if we started harassing people around us, right? What if we like got together and started harassing folks, right? Oh
And
yeah.
also, sorry, but like paid Steven Crowder on a monthly basis, right? And like, look, I think supporting your media producers is an important thing. Thank you very much, patrons.
Yeah.
This should not be substituted for a movement. And that, like, so it's like Rumble, like, as like, oh, here's this the way to sell free speech. Like, I don't quite think that the investors are putting up their money for those reasons. Here is where Russ, I think, tries to score some points and I think gets run over.
I suppose that where my focus is, Stephen, tends to be on the movements of power and finance and how the neoliberal establishment has been co-opted by the same financial interest that 30 or 40 years ago would have been presumed to be affiliated with the conventional right. I'm talking about Wall Street, military industrial complex, big pharma. And over the period of the pandemic, it became sort of plain to me that what we were being offered was a lens to how power was operating, and the fact that there was no meaningful opposition from anywhere other than spaces that are typically now labeled as the alternative right. This is where we saw sort of criticisms emerging, where people were willing to have the conversation. So,
you know, I would say one thing. This is where,
I mean, before I let Crowder answer that, like, what fucking planet is Russ living on? Like, what's he even talking about? I think he's talking about COVID. But for which I would put a counterexample of, like, all of the workplace organizing we've seen. Like, that's a part on the left that you're seeing, that, and you're not seeing that imploded by the right at all. And it would be nice if Russ would be a little bit more supportive of that. Well, let's let Crowder jump in here, because, I mean, where he goes with this
missed opportunity at one point in time. I would disagree somewhat with just the presupposition that people on the right, for example, you mentioned like banks. I don't know if you remember, but the Tea Party, when it came about, everyone was accusing them of being racist. Rick Santelli's rant was against the bailouts. It was the right wing who said we shouldn't be bailing out big banks. You know, you're talking about the West Indian Trading Company, I believe, was like a fifth of population Earth, right? At one point, no company is too big to fail. So the right wing view, the conservative view, has always been no bailouts for anybody. But then Occupy Wall Street came out, and they had the same problems, but they believed that the Tea Party folks were racist because that's how the media labeled them. But both of them were against bailing out big banks.
Is that how you remember it?
Not really. No, I mean, like, you know, apart from maybe like, you know, Ron Paul's, wasn't who was lining up. I mean, you know, all of these folks were playing the same game. I mean, that was one of the reasons that, like, Mitt Romney, you know, really couldn't get much traction in 2012, right? It's because, like, he's from the exact same class, has the exact same class interest as Obama did, and also, like, just like this maybe is like beyond the scope of this conversation, but, like, you don't want, like, you don't act in a moment like that. That thing could have been way worse. Like, the criticism is not necessary that you prevent, like, a crisis from getting worse. It was where the money went and in whose pockets it went that was, like, the problem, right? Because you let something like that get out of control. I mean, the people who are going to suffer the most are going to be working people, right? Because they're the people who are like, yeah, the rich take a haircut and it's awful, right? And it's bad. There's lack of investment, a depression. But
they also buy up all the assets too, right? It's also shopping time for them.
It's shopping time for them, right? You know, but it's like the people on the breadlines, the people unemployed for prolonged periods of time are, like, working folks, right? Exactly. And that's with, you know, the bailouts and, like, the activity, like, the left critique of you know, Obama and, like, the bailing out of the banks was that they should have taken control of all of these systems. You know, from the get-go, and utilize those assets better than those private corporations were using them. Obama wasn't interested in doing that. I mean, he famously said, "I'm the only person standing between you and the pitchforks." I don't know. It just you know, there's not a confluence here of, like, somebody who's critical of, like, Wall Street and, like, the libertarian fantasy of no action in a crisis like that.
A quote from Santelli: reward people that can carry water instead of drink the water. Like, it was a completely anti-human, like, brutal response that he was desiring from the financial crisis. And, like, that's the thing, is like the government should intervene, and it should be for keeps instead of as partners. And that's the real problem there. And here's the final clip of Crowder and Russ here.
cars have been better lately. You try and get a car with a chipset on the
And this is where, like, I mean, Crowder goes on and on
I
about
just
how
love where I don't know where this is. It's like it's a funny jump to just hear him talk about chips and cars.
this is about how actually centralized government is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
cars have been better lately. You try and get a car with a chipset on the lot. How about insurance companies? Did Obamacare work out? How about banks? Are they being honest by you? What kind of interest are you getting on your CD? These are all the most regulated industries that exist, and they're the ones that people hate the most, and they think the solution is more regulation. If the media hadn't done the tarring and feathering and labeled all conservatives and the Tea Partiers, who are largely good people, the people who probably not only support me now, but probably by and large tune into your show, good, hardworking American people, if they hadn't been labeled racist, and they could effectively do that back then because there wasn't really the alternative podcast sphere or alternative media, you would have had a much stronger coalition of them and the Occupy Wall Street people. The problem is the end game, because the Occupy Wall Street people, a lot of them wanted to nationalize the banks, and of course that's where I get off the train. But they both had a problem with bailouts. And so it's never been a right-wing position to bail out big banks.
Yes.
Do you want to say something before we let Russ jump in there? All right, here he
Well, let's
goes.
let the king speak.
Of course, famously, this bailout took place under a neoliberal establishment administration, and that's notable, evident, and obvious.
Both Bush and Obama. They were very similar in a lot of ways. They weren't all that different.
I feel like that what we can agree upon is that centralized establishment politics is ultimately going to move to the tune and rhythm of secondary interests that remain unimpeded by administrative fluctuation. That sort of like seems pretty clear at this point. And another thing where I think we broadly agree is I don't like the tone of condescension that.
Okay, yeah, so we can stop there. So he lets Crowder go on this frankly Thatcherite rant against regulation and how we should have free markets for all this stuff. And then they agree that neoliberalism is bad. What the fuck?
Well, it's just like, again, like Obamacare is 100% a disaster. It was a massive giveaway to corporations. Look, it's bad. And like when we think about where we are in the fight for Medicare for all in this country, I mean, that was certainly a wasted opportunity. And like one from like, oh, well, Obama thinks that like, well, maybe if I take a right wing plan, then they won't attack it. Well, one, they're already going to do that. And two, like if you're a normal person, particularly in states like the places where I'm from, where you don't have as much like federal money going into that, like what do you see with this other than a mandate that you participate in a system that's charging you $400, $500 a month for healthcare that you can't use, right? It was a massive giveaway to the insurance industry, an industry that doesn't need to exist, right? Again, going back to what we we're talking about in the main show, like any rational society, you don't need a private insurance industry. You don't need to protect that industry.
Yep.
Right. So like Obamacare was a problem, but it wasn't like literally the problem there is not like too much government. It was literally saying that like, no, we need the private sector to take the lead on this. Like we have to have the private sector because of the government. Like this is what, I mean, like not to be a pedant or anything like that, but this is the other thing. It's like, what is neoliberal in that? I mean, I'm sorry. I have some serious doubts about Crowder's grasp of the concept of neoliberal, and even for Brand, it seems like neoliberal. He's talking about Thatcher and stuff like these are the harbingers of that system, right? It sounds like what they mean by that is like the new liberal, right?
Yes, I mean Democrats basically, and I guess labor. Like, I mean, that's why it's this posture of like, oh, like even Crowder can do it. Like, yeah, we just all hate. Yeah, but you're doing this in support of free market deregulation, and like, I'm sorry, but like what we needed for the Mark Fisher point, like what we needed from Russ there is the Russ that says the NHS saved my mom's life.
Yeah.
Like that's what, and you know what? It's not authoritarian that the government does that. And I'm afraid that you're not going to get there at Cantor Fitzgerald Acquisition Corp 6/Rumble.
I mean, I think this is the sad thing about Russell Brand is that like I 100% agree with Mark Fisher, in his analysis and actually in the Vampire Castle, that like one, like what Brand was doing was more attractive and interesting to normal people than the left, generally like the culture stuff is. And I don't think the sad thing about the Fisher piece is like it's the same. It's the exact same mentality and the exact same kind of problems there. But what has changed is brand. And the thing is, like, if you're tuning into, like, again, like the point, like, you go on the right wing things and you talk to them, and you maybe, you grab the things that they try to point at, the real things that you feel. If it's a Jordan Peterson talking about alienation, if it's a Tucker Carlson talking about a powerlessness that you feel in your democracy, if it's a Crowder in that sense talking about the banks screwing you over, what you do is you say, hey, you're trying to claim this thing or talk about this thing, I'm going to snatch that from you and say, like, this is the side that has the answers to that kind of
Yes.
that, like, actual solutions to this kind of thing. And the sad thing about brand right now is, I'm just going to be honest, is like, you're not getting in that interview, right? And whatever, like, let's just say strategy wise, like, you don't want to be too combative, you want to maybe bring some of those people into your audience, and then you talk to them on your platform, whatever. But the sad thing is, man, is that it doesn't seem like that's going to be happening on the brand platform either. Do you know what I mean? Like, so you can't even make the arguments like, oh, we'll be, friendly and whatever, there, camaraderie there, to then, bring them over to your thing so you could talk to them, one-to-one or whatever. It's not happening on the brand platform either, because it's the same, it's a different tenor. I don't want to say it's all the same, but the fixation is just like, there's Bill Gates and there's Fauci and there's mask mandates, and like, that's preventing you from enjoying your personal liberty, right? It's like, all right. And like, look, like, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say one quick on like that should be the advantage of the left, that we can take their ball and dribble it better than they're used to because of fucking Democrats, right? Like, that's why, to the extent that like AOC or Ilhan or those folks are ever like impressive, it's because they're like doing things that should be like a politician should be able to avail on if they weren't just entirely like corporately bought. Like just basic points about billionaires shouldn't like exist, right? Like, and that, but instead Russ is just like, oh yeah, they're bad, and you guys have some interesting answers about the banks, I guess, now all of a fucking sudden, the Tea Party. Like, I mean, just absurd.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a shame, but
Too bad. So sad. It is a shame. It's unfortunate to see something like that happen. And I don't know, like, I don't want to make you cast aspersion or anything like that. Like, I think the brand stuff is genuine.
Yeah.
I think he like has to own it. I don't think it's a cynical money grab. I mean, I don't think that might not, like, subconsciously like play a factor or a role in these kind of things, knowing that like some of the things that I say that seems to get them really happy, some of the things I say don't get them as interested, maybe. But I think brand, is sort of in it right now.
He's
versus
also
like,
a guy
making a pivot to like make some money on right wing COVID stuff.
Yeah, I think he can arrive at that sort of naturally by virtue of being a media figure who has been red baited. You communists, you wear that Che shirt, like,
Yeah.
probably, and and he's not a part of like a movement, so it's not like he's like getting the best political. Maybe he'll get like Ed Miliband on the show once or twice, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like, and like they tried to get Chomsky on, but Chomsky would never come on. And so like now he's a little bit older, he's got a family, and he also like these principles, like I said, like it's not that he might not believe them, it's just that like objectively speaking they're not disinterested, and investors might have a different reason for employing them.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think that's the best way to think about it. Well,
Got any Discord?
We sure do. Man, it's a bummer.
It sucks. I might go listen to some of the
Yeah,
old
you should.
BBC
Let us know.
music.
Like, give us a little hint on what's happening. And what's this show called?
The old Russell Brand stuff, or which?
The new one. Oh, you're saying you're listening to the old
I'm
one.
gonna listen to the old stuff and remember, the good old days when he was prank phone calling old rock stars.